All right, welcome. Today we're here with Amanda Butterfield. Amanda, why don't you go ahead and tell us about yourself?
Well, my name is Amanda Butterfield. I am the marketing and admissions director for Liberty Addiction Recovery. So my job essentially is to help people be able to get into treatment, whether it's with us if they call and they're in need, or if they need to be referred to another program.
Okay, what are the best ways to contact you or look about Liberty Recovery?
Yes, so you can see our website. It's www.libertyaddictionrecovery.com, where you'll be able to see kind of our treatment modalities and what our program is about. And then you can also reach me on my email, which is amandab@libertyaddictionrecovery.com. And then my cell phone is 801-946-7658.
Okay, perfect. So we'll go ahead and get started on our questions. The first one I have for you today is, how have you seen addiction impact relationships?
I guess I feel like an easier question would even be how does addiction not affect relationships, right? When someone is in active addiction, and I'll preface all of this conversation with saying I am an addict in recovery. And so my sobriety date is December 14th of 2017. So I have just shy of 5 years sober. My drug of choice was heroin. And so I also have family members who are in recovery or have been in active addiction, and then being myself, and then also being, on the other end of it as far as the professional and working with people in treatment. But addiction is a tornado. It's going to take down any relationship that is close to you. So we've seen mothers that lose custody of their children. I've seen, even for me, siblings become completely separated and have zero contact. Children who are unable to talk with their parents, or you just constantly hear the families seeing their loved ones slowly kill themselves. And so, like I said, I think a shorter answer is like, how does it not affect it? Because it affects it in every single way. You lose trust, you lose accountability. As an addict, you will steal and lie and manipulate to get what you need to feed your addiction. And so it just kind of completely consumes. And I think a lot of people, it's getting better in society, but there's a common misconception that addiction is a choice. So a lot of family members are like, they just need to stop using, or they just need to get a job and do this. Well, I understand and I can appreciate that view, but if that was the case, then there wouldn't be addiction. If we had the ability to just stop using, we wouldn't be in this situation in the first place. And so what happens is there's, different, we'll call them qualifying factors that what makes someone an addict. And so then what happens first, so for someone like me, it is in my gene genetically, and then you have environmental, and then kind of, I forget the last one. I want to say it's like the way you were raised, or kind of self-esteem, self-love. And so when I first used, obviously my intention in that first use was not to be an addict. But from the very first time I used heroin, I didn't go more than 3 days without doing it. So what happens is you have your frontal cortex, then you have your left and your right hemisphere of your brain. Back tucked away in the very back, it's like this. So here's the front of your brain, and this right here, this is your midbrain. So what happens is when an addict or alcoholic uses, that substance becomes your number one priority in life. Now, in the midbrain is where you have that fight or flight response, right? So what happens is you have fight, flight. And what happens when an addict or an alcoholic uses, it becomes that substance. So it's alcohol, it's heroin, whatever it is. And that comes before food, survival, safety, anything. So I think a lot of people knowing that it can help them. It's not a moral thing. It's not a moral dilemma. It's not a choice between good or bad. We're not bad people trying to get well. We are sick people trying to get better. So hopefully that answers that question for you.
Yeah. Kind of going with the same thing you said, it impacts every relationship. So have you seen addiction lead to divorce or endings of relationships?
I would say, unfortunately, more often than not, it leads to divorce. And for those, who it doesn't lead to divorce, it is years and years of carnage and wreckage, and trust being broken. And then what happens is the other partner who isn't an addict has so much self-esteem issues and blames themselves. And it can be a very toxic very, very toxic situation. So I would say, unfortunately, more often than not, divorce is a part of it. Which sometimes doesn't, and I don't say like that as a bad word, that divorce is a bad word, because sometimes, you get these this toxic thing, and you separate them, and you're able to kind of grow and develop and move on from such that nastiness. So yes, 100%, there's quite a bit of divorce involved.
So have you seen any relationships survive through addiction recovery? We talked about ones that end, but like,
Yeah.
you seen any survive or grow stronger, better, more connected through addiction
Totally,
recovery?
totally. So I think, and I don't necessarily share this with everyone, especially those people coming into treatment, because usually people come into treatment and they have a significant other that they're using with, and it's a very, like I said, very toxic situation. But I myself, my husband and I, we met in sobriety and we relapsed together, and we now have the exact same sobriety date. So, and again, that's kind of, our story is kind of one of those that's not recommended. It's kind of the road less traveled, but I wouldn't change it for anything. And then even on a side note, watching people get into recovery and rebuild that trust and rebuild those relationships, 110%, I've seen that too. And those relationships, I would say 10 times out of 10 are better than when they were prior to the addiction. Does that make sense? They're more emotionally honest. They're more connected. They're more transparent with each other. There's no secrets. I mean, I could go on and on and on. And so to see that transition is a huge part of recovery and a huge part of hope for people too. So, yeah.
So a lot of people say like, oh, people can't change, like the phrase like once an addict, always an addict, but how have you seen people change to addiction recovery and move on to have healthy and happy relationships? Do you believe that phrase, that addict, once an addict, always an addict, or how do you?
That's a very tricky question. So I'm going to just paint a picture too. So, 5 years ago in December, my husband and I were living out of our car. I'm an IV user that was, and like I said, heroin was my drug of choice. Fast forward to now. I mean, I know for a fact that when people meet me, I hear it all the time. Well, you don't look like a heroin addict. And so 100%, I've seen that change. I know that for me personally, I'm not able to use substances recreationally. So just the way that I use and my addiction, all of my isms, if you will, I'm not able to drink normally. I'm not a normal drinker. And I think that is the case for the majority of addicts. I won't say all of them, because I do think that there are people who are exceptions to kind of the rule or the general population, if you will, with addicts. But yes, those stories of redemption are so amazing, and they're out there for sure. Unfortunately, though, there's a massive amount of people who don't seek recovery and who never are able to get better. And that's what, us at Liberty Addiction Recovery, that's what we're trying to do, is just make a dent. And just even if we can help one person, I mean, if you can help one person, it's a ripple effect, right? Because then you help that family. And then, I mean, just because of how rampant addiction is, that family knows someone who has an addict, and then it just kind of goes on and on and on. So 100%, that change is very, very possible, but it doesn't come without action, and it definitely doesn't come without work. So.
Okay. So what advice do you have for people who have loved ones who are in addiction recovery?
This is a really good one. And like I said, being, in recovery myself, but also being on the other side where I've had family members, I've had, ample amount of friends. It's very, very hard to watch someone. And I think a lot of times, especially, for me having lived it, it's easy for me to say, oh, we'll just do X, Y, and Z and you'll be fine. But I think that outsiders, we really don't know what's going on emotionally with that person. And so really, my biggest advice would be to set and hold boundaries. There's kind of a saying where family members can love their loved one to death, literally to death. And what that means is, lack of boundaries. So giving someone money to go get their drugs, allowing them a safe place to stay. And along kind of with that saying comes another saying that's, if nothing changes, nothing changes. So if someone has a place to stay, their access to money, or at least things to sell, or, you know, food, if their basic needs are taken care of, why would they get sober, right? Why would they change? And I think that's where the family comes in, and that's where you have to be able to set and hold boundaries. Boundaries are not meant to control your loved one or your addict, but they're meant to protect you. And so I would say that's hands down number one. If you have a family member that's struggling, then the second one would be to seek help for yourself. We don't, when we are in our addiction, we don't realize the damage that we're doing to our loved ones. My parents took it very personal, and my dad got mad and my mom got sad, and then there was conflicts between the two, and at one point it was very, very strenuous on their marriage. And so until they were able to go get help for themselves, were they able to come together. And so I would say that's a very big one. Whether there's tons of free resources out there too, for loved ones of addicts and alcoholics, but there's also, I would say, you know, get a therapist and start looking inward on what you can do to better yourself, because you can't change and fix other people. And I think a lot of times, you know, my dad talks about this, where when someone told him that when I was early in my addiction, my disease, and he was like, well, it's not my problem. I'm not the one that's using. It's her problem. She needs to get fixed, and then I will be happy. I'll be better. But that's a very, very toxic thought process. And that's not really how it works. They had to come to a point, my parents had to come to a point, and I talked to hundreds of family members that have to get to this point where, you know, you look at and you examine, what is your greatest fear with your addict, with your loved one? And a lot of it is death, is that they're going to die in their addiction, and that, you know, whatever that may look like, that death. And so it got to a point for my parents where they had to accept that was a very real possibility, because what happened is that pain that they were going through becomes paralyzing, and they're not able to function. They're not able to show up for their job. They're not able to show up for their 4 other kids and their 15 other grandchildren. They're completely paralyzed by this fear and by this sadness. And so by really looking at that fear, at that greatest fear, and accepting it, was how they were able to kind of, okay, well, is death the worst thing? And at the point, they got to the point where it wasn't, because me living in that addiction, and, you know, the trauma that comes from that, the pain and suffering that me as their child was going through, that was worse. Me living my addiction was worse than death for them, you know? And so I think that's something to really look at. So to reiterate, you know, boundaries, holding and setting boundaries, looking at yourself and working on yourself, and then really pinpointing what is the greatest fear and why can't I hold these boundaries, because you still have to show up to your own life, even when you have a loved one doing this. I mean, I've heard of so many family members that have lost jobs because they're picking their loved one up from jail, you know, time and time again, or, you know, whatever it is, the situation, it varies, but it's so common. And so really to work on yourself and love yourself enough to hold boundaries, because your life still goes on, and not to feed the addiction in any way. And there's this, you know, there was a saying my parents used to say to me, we will do anything we can to help you get better, but we will not do a dang thing to help you in your addiction. And so absolutely no money. You cannot live in our home if you're using. I mean, they were very, very strict boundaries, you know, and it was painful for them. But I can honestly say that it was a huge factor in when I got sober, you know. So that would be my advice. There's so much support out there. I believe Utah is number 2 for the amount of treatment centers that we have. I believe Florida is number 1, and then I think California is number 3. So there's so many resources out there. Some are free. Insurance covers a lot as far as therapy. So there is so much help out there. It's crazy. So
You kind of mentioned this a little bit, which the difference between like supporting and enabling.
mm-hmm.
So you're saying that like make sure you're not enabling them, right, by allowing them a place to live or money.
Yeah.
How can you support them without enabling them?
That's a really good question.
What helps people?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. So I think that's where the lines get blurred, right? So enabling is kind of piggybacking off of that last kind of quote I said, is if you're helping them to continue and to maintain in their addiction. So if you're giving them money, if you're giving them a place to live, if you're, paying for things for them. And granted that it has to go with your own value system. So then, as like I've said, I have a family member who is now in recovery. And I had to look at where my values lied with that. Obviously it was a little bit different because I wasn't a spouse or a child or anything like that. But I wasn't willing to help in his addiction. So does that make sense? So then ways to support. So on that other end, I would say ways to support are, showing that unconditional love, because shame is 100% what feeds an addiction. And the difference between shame and guilt is guilt is I've done something bad. Shame is I am bad. And so I would say addicts and alcoholics are some of the most broken and self-hating and self-deprecating people I've ever met. I mean, they can list off every bad thing they've ever done, but if you were to say, what's one good thing about yourself? They can't do it. They can't even look at themselves in the mirror in the bathroom, And so I would say to show them that you have unconditional love, to encourage them to do treatment and help them find resources. Because if you say you need to go to treatment, it's overwhelming. You don't really know where to start, so helping them find resources to get better. And then I would say, lastly, like you said, no, never giving them money to buy their substance. If they're using in your home, I would kick them out unless they want help. I'm trying to think of other examples. Those are kind of the big ones, So, and there were times, early on where like even my parents would buy me groceries, but then what I would do is I'd find the receipt and then I would go return the groceries and take the money. So we're resourceful people, right? And so, finally they got to that point. They were like, I'll buy you a meal at McDonald's, but I'm not buying you groceries, because it was all manipulation on my end. So, does that answer your question? That was kind of a lot.
No, yeah,
know.
that does.
Okay.
Okay. There is a
Cool.
fine line between support and enabling. And you kind of mentioned it earlier, but like the codependency on your child's success or relatives or spouses' success of getting over their addiction is very difficult for the person who is addicted, right? Knowing that totally. My parents' happiness is dependent on how I carry myself and my actions, and that the fact I'm still in this cycle makes them sad, makes addiction itself worse.
Totally perpetuates the problem. And that's kind of why I had mentioned, like, get some help for yourself, because I think that a lot of people don't recognize the expectations. And then what happens is, as you said, it makes the addiction worse, because I could look into my parents' eyes and I could feel their disappointment. I mean, it was like oozing out of them, you know what I mean? And they're like, oh my gosh, we have a daughter who's a heroin addict, like all of that. And so as they worked on themselves, it got to a place where in their eyes, I could just see love. It was just like, we just want you to be better. Whatever that looks like, we just want you to be better, So, but 100%, the other thing to keep in mind is a lot of times what addicts and alcoholics will do is then emotionally blackmail. And so, for example, I have an uncle who's, I believe he just celebrated 10 years sober, and he was started out addicted to pain pills and then moved to crack cocaine. And he, did jail time, is a convicted felon, all of that kind of stuff. And what happened is my dad had set a boundary with him, because my dad was kind of helping him. My dad had set a boundary with him, and it was my grandpa. My grandpa had set a boundary with him, like, no, you can't live here. And then a couple of days later, my uncle said, well, I need money. There's some really bad people that are after me, and if I don't pay them, then I'm going to die. And my grandpa lovingly said, I'm so sorry that you're in that situation. Please know that I love you. And that was it. And so then my uncle goes like, well, I'm going to die and it's going to be your fault. And so you have to be kind of prepared, but keep in mind, the person you're dealing with is not in their right mind. I mean, they are literally physically dependent on a substance, to where if they don't have it, they get physically ill. So you can only imagine the blurry and kind of lack of ability to make logical and emotionally healthy decisions. It's not there. So I think to kind of prep people for that, like, this could very well happen. And that's okay. You have to be okay with yourself enough to, well, if that happens, that happens. That's not my choice. That was theirs. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
That's easier said than done.
Well, yeah, if you're willing to love someone from a distance, you might come back and say, well, if you really love me, you'd be doing this for me. But you can't help them in the way they would like you to help them because of your addiction. So you have to be able to like love from a distance and not be dependent on their gratification of what you give them as like a self note of like, oh, I am a good person at loving, because a lot of people, their love language is like gift giving or like words of affirmation, but you're not going to get those if you're setting strong boundaries and being supportive and not enabling.
Totally. And there's already, I think majority of addicts and alcoholics already have so much anger inside anyway. And I would say 95% of that anger is directed at themselves. Mm-hmm. And so when something happens, when a barrier is brought onto their path, and that path of using, right? If there's something that makes it harder for me to get my drug or to be able to get money to get my drug, I'm going to demolish it, and that's what we were talking about with the brain. It's not a choice. It's literally survival. So their entire body, there's a physiological response. And so every cell in their body is literally saying, you have to get this substance. And if you don't, we're going to die. So that's when you see addicts and alcoholics go against every single one of their values. They go against who they are to the core in order to get what it is that they need to feel better. You know what I'm saying? To function. And that's when it does get hard, and those words sting, but you have to, that's why I was, again, that's just why doing therapy for yourself, having a support system for yourself, because I like to think of each one of those things, therapy, support system, Al-Anon meetings, research about addiction, whatever it may be. Each piece of that is like armor that you're putting on yourself, because you are you're battling something that is much bigger than you. Addiction is not a choice. It's now classified as a disease. And so you're going up against this disease that is nasty and that will fight dirty and will fight until it gets what it wants. And so you have to make sure that you're well equipped and that you love yourself and your loved one enough to protect yourself and to put that armor on you. Mm-hmm. So each time, I think therapy is your chest plate. I think, a community of people or a group of people, even if it's one person that understands that you can talk to and share with, and that can, kind of call you out too and say, I don't think that was the best thing. That's your helmet, and so on and so forth. So, yeah.
Okay. One last question for you. That's kind of a two-part question. One is, what would you say to someone who is in an addiction, who feels like they just can't break their cycle of addiction and they feel like they're just still stuck in this rut no matter what they do or how many times they try? And what do you say to someone who sees that, like as a parent to their child, being like, my child just can't get out of this, like this rut? What would you say to both of them? Is there hope for them?
So for the addict, I would say you can't solve a problem with the same tools that the problem was created. Right. So I think a lot of times, and again, in society, there's a common misconception that just stop using and you'll be fine. And I even had that at times. If I just was able to get an apartment and a good job, I could stay sober. If I just did this, then I could stay sober, And so I would say, get rid of that. This is bigger than you. And it goes emotionally very deep and mentally very deep. And then physically, there's a whole other issue. And so I would say if nothing changes, nothing changes. And so reach outward for help, whether that's outpatient, whether that's, there's free 12-step meetings, there's medical detox. There is so much support. There's sober gyms, there's sober softball. I mean, there is so much of a support within the recovery and the sobriety community. So that's what I would say to that person. And I would also acknowledge, the pain that they're going through. It's not easy. No one wakes up, at the age of 14 and says, I want to be a heroin addict when I grow up, or I want to be a raging alcoholic. No one says that. It's a very, very painful, very trying, very belittling experience and lifestyle to live. So I would say that. I would say it's okay. And I would also say that no matter what your head tells you, you are worth recovery and sobriety and hope. No matter what you've done, no matter who you've hurt, there is nothing so bad that doesn't deserve redemption when it comes to addiction and alcoholism and drug addiction. Now, for the parent or for the family, for that person, I would say really evaluate what are you doing to help that person want to get better. And the same kind of saying, if nothing changes, nothing changes. So I would encourage them to look inward. What am I doing to contribute to the situation? Am I helping them stay sick, or am I helping them get better? And then I would constantly encouraging that person. You don't need to tell them what to do. You don't need to tell an addict, well, you just need to stop using, or well, you just need to go back to church. It's bigger than that. And so really utilizing those professional resources and helping with that, I think could be a big help for that. A lot of times that's the case in my position, is that family reaches out and they say, this is the situation. What do I do here? And so it's really like, okay, well, you can set and hold a boundary, and maybe a part of that boundary is you need to get treatment, or we're not going to have a relationship while you're actively using, So does that answer your question? That was kind of okay.
It does, but also maybe I have one more question. I'm sorry.
Yes, no, hit it. Yeah.
I'm wondering, like, when does someone realize they're an addict? Because there must be a point in time where you just think, well, I could just stop. It's not that big of a deal. I'm just doing this for fun. This is just recreation. So usually how long does that take for someone to notice I'm actually dependent on this? And do you think that happens after family realizes the dependency? Like, how long does that take internally to be like, oh, I have an issue?
No problem. You know what? That's a really, really good question. And as for most things, it's not one size fits all. But I think that the addiction, because even when an addict gets sober, if they don't work internally on their thinking errors, on their emotional trauma, or even just emotional regulation, on their, cognitive behavioral views, on their perception, on their resentments, all of that stuff, if they don't work on that, they still have that addict mind mentality. And so I've seen some people who come to treatment, they have maybe 3 DUIs, 4 DUIs, they've done jail time, and they still don't think there's a problem. So I think that it depends solely on the person, but that you might have stumped me with that question. When do you realize that you're an addict? And I don't think it's when the family realizes it, because for me, I knew that I had a problem when I started to get physically ill when I didn't have my substance. I'll never forget it. I was with a group of people that I was using with, and we were waiting for our drug dealer, and I started sniffling really bad. And someone said, "Are you sniffling?" And I said, "Yeah, I just don't feel very good today." And they said, "You're in withdrawal." And I was like, oh my gosh, this isn't fun anymore. I'm now physically dependent on this. So I do think that it does vary for people, but that addictive mind, that alcoholic mind, is so powerful at convincing you that you don't have a problem. And then what it does is it takes your situation and compares to all these other people, so when my very, very first treatment, I would say, well, I'm not as bad as that person because I wasn't shooting up heroin, right? Meth addicts would come in and say, well, I'm not as bad as that person because I'm only using meth, I'm not using heroin. Or, alcoholics would come in and say, well, my drug of choice, alcohol, is legal. I buy it from the store. I'm not as bad as these people. And so there's a very big deflection that goes on in this realm. And so that's why I think it's vital to have, like I said, whether it's 12-step meetings, whether it's some kind of sober support, whether it's professionals in a treatment setting, it's vital to have people who can just cut through and say, do you hear yourself? Because look at what you've lost due to your alcoholism. And I would say it really isn't until that person can look at themselves in the mirror, or look at themselves truly with no shenanigans, and can say, my name is Amanda and I am an addict, or my name is so-and-so and I have a problem. I don't think it's until that happens that the healing can really begin. And even then, there are days where it's like, oh, well, I'm a heroin addict, I can drink, right? Or, I've even had thoughts before that's like, oh, well, I can use cocaine recreationally, right? You still have those really negative, toxic thoughts that come in, and that's a part of the whole thing. So does that answer that question?
Yeah, it does.
Okay.
I was wondering. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Yes, of course.
But do you have any closing comments or points you want to point out?
I would just say that I think, in my opinion, and what I've experienced in my life experience, working with people in their addiction, having family members, having lived through it myself, I think that addiction thrives off of shame. And so what happens is, not only on the addict side, but on the family side, you get to this point where you're like, as a parent, I must have done something wrong that my child turned out like this. Or a spouse, I'm not good enough. That's why my spouse is an alcoholic. Whatever it may be. And it keeps you sick, and it keeps you from being able to ask for help and to be able to share. And then, like we talked about earlier, it just perpetuates the problem. And that happens with the addict alcoholic as well as the family. So if I could say anything, I would say you are 110% not alone. And and there is so much help out there, and there's so much hope. I mean, I'm not kidding when I say I on like I've said again, I was a cold December day, I was living in my car. I had my dog and who's now my husband. We share the same sobriety date, and we would gather our change to get gas so that we could keep the car on at night, so that we weren't freezing. If someone like me can do it, when I literally got sober, I had a garbage bag of clothes to my name, and that was it. To where I am now, where all the material stuff, yes, it's there, but I have a real relationship. I have two children now who never ever have seen me high or drunk. They don't even know that side of me. My family trusts me. I have the garage code to my parents' house, and it was years before I had that. So I would say there's never a low that is not capable of redemption. The lowest that you can get is death. And so you have to ask yourself, am I willing to die in my addiction, my disease? So, and then for the family, I would say, love your addict, love your loved one, because they're beating themselves up more than you ever could, even when you're frustrated and you're angry with them. But keep in mind, you can love them to death, literally to death. And so, work on yourself and all of that too. But I think, again, to reiterate, there are so many resources out there available for addiction and recovery, that there's no excuse basically at this point. It's amazing how much is out there.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time and
Yes.
sharing your
Yes.
experiences and knowledge with us. Would you please remind us how we could get in contact with you?
Yeah. Yep. So, and can I just give a little snippet about Liberty too?
Go for it.
So Liberty Addiction Recovery, we have a residential program in Bluffdale, Utah. Residential is when they come and live at the facility, basically 24 hours, 24/7, right? It's about 45 to 60 days is the program. We do work with insurances and all of that kind of stuff as well. But really, it's amazing. That's one of the highlights of my job, is when I get to bring someone in, and then to even see them after a week and see there's a different countenance. They have a light in their eye. They physically look different. So that's our residential. And then from there, one of our big things that we like to focus on is, what does it look like after residential? So we also have sober living, as well as day treatment and intensive outpatient. Day treatment, you just go during the day, and then outpatient, you go 3 times a week for 3 hours. So you have that accountability and all of that kind of stuff too. And then we have an alumni meeting where people who are graduates can come and share. And so our big thing is we really want to get to the nitty gritty of what's contributing to your use. Our therapists are trauma certified, so they're able to work with trauma work. And I've gone to treatment several times, but I think one of the biggest things that sets us apart from other facilities, because there's so many in Utah, is our owners. They're two men. And their names are Jeff and Roger. And I've never seen two owners more passionate about helping people and genuinely wanting to help as many people as they can, but give them the best quality of care. I've never seen that before from two owners. I mean, they come in and they run groups so that they're in contact with the clients. It's pretty amazing. So that's a little bit about Liberty. And if anyone has more questions, they can also reach out to me. My email address again is Amanda B as in boy at libertyaddictionrecovery.com. We also have our website, which is just libertyaddictionrecovery.com as well. You can see the facility. It's a beautiful, beautiful home. You get kind of a 3D tour that way, and there's a couple of testimonials, and then you can really get a breakdown of our program and what we focus on. And then my phone number is just 801-946-7658. So you could shoot me a text, you can give me a call, but I'm always willing to help. And even if our facility doesn't end up being the right one, we work with a handful of other facilities that we fully trust, that I would send a family member to, and those kind of things, so that if we're not the right fit, then we can help assist them. That's something that I personally like to pride myself on, is if someone calls and I can't help them, I'm not like, sorry, we can't help you, bye. I know what it's like to make that call, that desperate call. And so it's like, yes, yeah. And so it's like, we can't help you, but let's figure out where can, and so that's why we have a few other facilities that we work with really, really closely for that purpose. So yeah, thank you so much for having me too, by the way. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yes.